This is the data dilemma. It's bridging offensive operations and machine learning. So I'm going to give this microphone is right in my face. All right, there we go. Okay, that's better. All right, so really quick agenda what I'm going to cover. Hit a bit of an introduction. I'm going to talk about some kind of red team challenges that we tend to hit on operations. I'll give my background here in a moment. I'm going to talk a bit about my view of the offensive data landscape, and it goes without saying, this is all just personal opinion. I know some people might disagree, but I'm going to give my view of the problem. I'm going to touch on some offensive machine learning challenges that we've encountered over the last year as we've been trying to incorporate different things into our workflow. I'm going to touch on Nemesis, which I'm representing with the shirt, which I'll have a few slides on. This is not like a Nemesis-only presentation. It's more focused on data. And then I'm going to hit some final kind of closing remarks, seeing the forest for the trees, why I believe that these things matter, and then have some questions. And please feel free to argue with me at the end, whether here on microphone or if you want to talk to me in the back or something like that. I love talking about this stuff like most of the people here. So who am I? My name is Will Schroeder. My handle is harmjoy on Twitter and GitHub and the socials. I've talked to a lot of conferences and done a lot of training over the last several years. I'm mostly known as kind of an offensive developer, so I helped co-develop PowerShell Empire, PowerSploits, Bloodhound, the Nemesis project, GhostPack, and I was one of the two authors for the Active Directory Certificate Services, the certified pre-owned research that happened in the past year or two. But my real claim to fame is my handle is an indicator of compromise. If you don't have, some kind of IOC rule, already in your pipeline for harmjoy, then you should probably try a little harder. But full disclosure, I'm not a data scientist. I'm woefully lacking in all my maths. I have been kind of playing in this space since about 2019. I've taken some courses and things like that, read a lot of books, talked to a lot of people way smarter than myself. But I do have some I definitely have some gaps in my understanding in some of these things. So this talk is more kind of from an operational standpoint, specifically a lot of the challenges we had trying to build this stuff into our workflows. But basically TLDR, I'm a hacker who likes to build tools that make my coworkers' jobs easier. And unfortunately, some bad guys use them sometimes, but we do our best to be upfront about defenses and all that kind of fun stuff. So, background. One of the conversations I had with Nick and Will, the Dreadnought guys, yesterday, and if you didn't attend the workshop, it's awesome. I think they're going to be publishing the content at some point. But we're really kind of facing the birth of a new industry with the fusion of data science and information security with kind of this proliferation of large language models. Obviously, this has been happening on the kind of professional defensive side for a lot of these professional firms. But from the offensive side, it just hasn't quite been the same pace of adoption. And with that, we're having to kind of build the shared vocabulary between data scientists and InfoSec professionals. So on the InfoSec side, would you think if you ask all the hackers in the room or something, do you know what gradient descent is? Do you know what backprop is? Things like that. There's going to be gaps of knowledge in that side. But at the same time, we have to be empathetic and know that, data scientists coming in also haven't had the same common terms that we've been using for years and years and years and years. So this is the only site kind of on this kind of thing. There's a great online site that's an accompaniment to a book written by a former coworker of mine, Joe Vest, who worked in the government doing red teaming stuff, and I was at AWS. This is just a really nice little short picture, kind of vulnerability assessment, pen testing, red teaming, how they kind of generally kind of play off each other. We have our own view on red teaming at our company because our CEO came from kind of NSA red teaming side kind of in his background. So we view it more as kind of challenging hypotheses, kind of more related to wargaming almost, a more classic kind of US military definition of it, where we view it kind of as, exercises that simulate a threat actor maneuvering against an org kind of as a scrimmage. But we're not other people have different definitions. I just kind of put this out there to say we need to also, if there's kind of a mixed audience, we need to ensure that we also kind of have this, make some strides towards that shared vocabulary. So, two different kind of things, offensive machine learning and adversarial machine learning. So I'm going to quote Will a lot, Muhax. He was definitely kind of my Sherpa in this space for several years. He still is. He'll be talking tomorrow, I believe, with Nick. So he defined it as application machine learning to offensive problems. So the offensive industry has kind of been bad at adopting other solutions to already solved problems. The best canonical example I can give is I was one of the founders for Bloodhound about 7, 8 years ago. I think it was 8 years ago now with Andy Robbins. And we had this intuition about how we do pathfinding and hopping from one machine and stealing creds and popping in another box. And we were trying to put terminology and everything around it, nomenclature. And Andy talked to one of his PhD math friends who was like, have you guys never taken a computer science class? This is literally graph theory 101. This has been solved for literally 50 years. Why are you not doing this? I'm like, oh, cool, and we did that. We felt kind of dumb at first, just thinking like, we hadn't solved that problem in that way, but no one else had in the industry either. So all I mean with that is that there are a lot of technologies and approaches to problems that have already been solved outside of InfoSec, and for some reason, particularly on the offensive side, we've been slow to adopt them. So things like workflows and all that kind of fun stuff that I know those guys are going to talk about tomorrow. But some of, I won't go over every single one of these, but there's so many things that we can use ML to augment and accelerate offensive operations. Evasion is obviously, a common one. Text analysis or password extraction. I'm going to talk a little bit about retrieval augmented generation on stolen documents, but tradecraft suggestions. I'm starting to move towards these, operator assistance platforms. I think a lot of us have been thinking a lot about these same problems for a lot of years, and for a long time, we didn't quite know how to solve them. And now with the augment of these large language models, it's definitely kind of opened up this Pandora's box and opened a lot of our eyes of saying like, okay, I think there's a lot more problems here that are solvable than there were 2 years ago. So adversarial machine learning, I'm not touching, this talk's gonna be about offensive machine learning in general. So Will defines adversarial machine learning as a subdiscipline that specifically attacks ML algorithms. He's a big fan of saying like adversarial is an intent. This is just a subset of using some like potentially adapted academic techniques to attack some deployed models. We heard about some of this yesterday from a couple speakers, but extraction for extracting like model weights to do like surrogate models offline. You're talking about like evasion for getting around like an EDR model, inversion for extracting training samples, which we're going to talk about in several slides because that's a very important thing that ties into all this stuff. Inference for determining if a training sample was present in a training set. And poisoning for like poisoning data sets at scale, which Will's actually did some work on with Carlini and some other guys this past year. It's like poisoning web data training sets at scale is practical. It's a super cool talk. That's kind of like just setting the base for everything. I'm gonna take a step back and just kind of talk a little bit about the red team challenges that we tend to encounter. So like our company, SpectraOps, we do a lot of engagements. We have 30 to 40 offensive operators now, functioning over a variety of teams, doing a variety of different problems, a variety of different engagements at a variety of lengths. So we've been doing this for years, and we've encountered a lot of the scaling problems that many people have encountered. So when you have a team of 3 or 4 people, you don't have to worry about knowledge transfer and formalized documentation and things to the point you have to when it's 30 to 40 people and you have new people coming in. So 3 of the common challenges that we've tended to hit is one is file and tool output triage is tedious and inconsistent. We'll touch on this a bit more, but like file share mining, data store mining, like going through a file share or a system and downloading lots of files and manually analyzing them tends to come up with results about 90+% of the time, but it's very, very manual. And I'll show an example of this in a few slides, at least up until this point. Also, there's kind of a temporal nature to some of this knowledge to where maybe a bit of information you pulled from a document on day 1 isn't useful then, but it is 3 weeks later. So that's still something we haven't quite solved, but information can mean different things at different phases of an engagement. Also, offensive data and tooling is not unified. Our tools don't talk well together. They don't interop well together. Everything was built for humans, not for systems or computers, which I'll talk about in a few slides. So we often have to use a lot of different tools to get our jobs done. Like we'll use multiple agents, Mythic, Cobalt Strike, Sliver. Some people use Stage 1, Nighthawk, whatever, C2 of your choice. A lot of times there'll be command line tools that you have to, that you might have to proxy in, and then you're having to deal with logs in a different space. It's just, everything isn't unified. You have lots of different pieces of data, normally unstructured text. And also, yeah, this data is just siloed. It's not collected. It can't be viewed from lots of different people unless you kind of rolled your own thing. There's been some approaches to this problem, but nothing's been perfect. But the big thing is the big one. Tradecraft is difficult to scale. And this is something Nick and Will will be talking about in their talk. But every operator has their own skill set. Every operator isn't good at the same thing that every other operator is. So like when new tradecraft comes out, how do you transfer that knowledge across all operators on your team? And Confluence and everything is great, but we can definitely do better. And hopefully we're taking some steps into doing that better. So manual triage, diving down a little bit more. Everyone's solved some of these workflow things in their own ways, but it's definitely a super common task. It's been very heavily manual up until at least fairly recently, still mostly is. Automated workflows, people are starting to come up with some of it, and this is kind of playing into we've ignored some of the technologies that have been, in other industries that have solved this stuff. There's definitely a huge amount of efforts and improvements that we can do along these lines. But, it's something, again, even now, it's like you can automate your Nmap scans, you can automate like different exploit tools and things like that or whatever else. You can automate lateral movement, you can automate pathfinding with Bloodhound, but a lot of the times it comes down to downloading a bunch of files from a file share or Confluence or an S3 bucket or something and, grokking through everything manually and then actually trying to see, like, am I gonna find whatever interesting information that I'm after? So definitely ways we can automate that. So kind of as an example, as a red team story time. So we break into Fortune 100 networks for the most part. I'm gonna go through just one small example of a typical operational headache we tend to have on some of these engagements. Oh yeah, and this is definitely not AI generated in any way whatsoever. Looks completely normal and rational. The glowing eyes definitely look human. So we have a Cobalt Strike interface right here. Let's say we download, we do a file listing and we see, okay, there's a tool, a program called program.exe. We think that might be interesting. We download it, we task a download, we have our asynchronous C2, everything downloads down. We're like, cool, that's great. Then we have to synchronize that from our control server back down to our attacker analysis server. We do some maybe basic file triage where we realize it's like a .NET assembly, which we didn't know beforehand. Then we have to move that over to like a Windows analysis system to some degree. Then we have to open it up in dnspy, knowing that's a .NET thing, do some of our additional kind of first level, like not reversing, but decompilation for .NET type stuff, scan for common vulnerabilities, things like that, open up and manually triage source code, and then do this like 100,000 times for the engagement. So this is something, this is a workflow, right? This is a workflow that people have done manually up until this point for the most part. Again, I'm not saying nobody has automations for this, but nobody has a universal solution for automations that they have released publicly. So there was a quote years ago saying like, if you can imagine it, it's probably already been done, but usually by not the kind of person that's gonna come talk at a security conference. So any of these types of things, I'm assuming that someone with enough money or government or somebody has already done these things, but I can only go on what I see publicly. Also, I can't know every single tool, so maybe someone just released something a few weeks ago and I just missed it, so I don't know. Don't at me, bro. So another thing is tooling challenges. Offensive tools weren't built to interop. Offensive tool, and this isn't a universal statement, but most offensive tools weren't built to interrupt. And this comes down in general to lack of structured data for offensive tooling. I actually posted last year an entire unstructured data post on Medium that dives into this in a lot of depth. It's mostly me just like yelling at clouds, but our tools, some things have structured data that let you play like for example, importing Nmap scans into a different tool or something like that. But in general, the things that have structured data tend to be the OSINT tools and like the network scanning tools. For PostX tools, there's the data tends to be presented as unstructured text, which up until a year or so ago has been very difficult for us to deal with. And then tooling to get the data we want might not even exist on the offensive side. So we've done a lot of efforts for this over the past few years with projects like Seatbelt. A lot of people have built beacon object files to get this situation awareness type data from a host or from a network, but there's a tooling gap as well. And now, one of the truths is we often have to fight defensive products to get the data we want. The defense has gotten significantly better over the past 5 years, and sometimes like just enumerating a particular registry key might get us caught. This is not the case 5 years ago. So this is just another complication. This is as opposed to defense, which I'll talk about, that doesn't have a lot of these restrictions. All right, data issues. Offensive data, just like tools, is mostly unstructured, and it's built for humans to consume, like I had mentioned. It also doesn't interop well. This is kind of echoing some of the things I said in the previous slides. But beyond that, we often have a lot of data sensitivity and retention issues as professionals. So we're professional consultants. I don't work on an internal team. Internal teams in governments have different processes and rules about how long they can keep data. But we have a data retention period that we have to contractually hold to for clients. We can't keep data forever. And the privacy issue that I'm going to talk about, I'll dive into that to a few slides, but there's a lot of sensitivity around, like you might be stealing some of the most sensitive data. You might be going after the crown jewels for an environment. What if you have all the domain admin passwords? What if you have the curb hash? What if you have the plans to their next gen X, Y, and Z or something like that? So privacy is a big deal for us. I think it is for most people. It's not for everybody. It should be, but there's this complicates stuff with machine learning, because ideally you want to keep all the data you can forever, as long as you are, train models and X, Y, and Z. But then it's like, well, if I train a model on sensitive data and throw out the sensitive data, can I still keep the model? It's like, well, I don't know about that. We'll talk to that in a little bit. So I don't have solutions for this. It's just these problems are still problems, even for us. And then scaling tradecraft. Like I mentioned before, all operators are not equivalently skilled. Someone that just started operating is not going to operate as well as someone that's been doing it 10 years. It's just a fact of life. Scaling tradecraft today for most organizations, again not all, but most, tends to be writing articles in Confluence, Notion, whatever else, some kind of shared notation type thing. This is great in that people can go look it up and know how to do X, Y, and Z. But the more documentation you have, the more onerous it is on an operator to be like, oh, how do I even know I need to go look this up? You can think about all this data. If we can contextualize it with our tools in tradecraft, we could do a lot better. And we don't have a way to scale this tradecraft, though, across teams, much less the entire industry. I think it's coming, but we're not there yet. So this is, I think, one of the bigger meta problems that we've cared about and a lot of people have cared about. Again, I think a lot of us have converged on the same point, and LLMs and the new generation of ML definitely can help us a lot here. So I'm really excited for what's going to come out in the next couple of years. But kind of along these lines is a quote from Fuller, Mubix, in 2021, saying like 80% of pen test firms and red teams I've been a part of don't have operational documentation that's even close to what was posted of the Google translated Conti playbook. That's part of the problem, right? So like literally just writing everything down well and having it all operationalized is something that a lot of teams don't do super well. People are getting better, but again, we have a long ways to go. So those are some of the problems that we've hit, kind of set the problem stage. Now I'm going to talk about some of the issues and caveats we've had with data from the offensive standpoint. So it's significantly easier to gather large data sets on the defensive side than it is on the offensive side. So outside of sharing malware, most organizations or groups or EDRs or vendors or whoever tend to keep this data to themselves, which that's expected. I'm not saying that everyone should take their data set and just give it to everybody. Like, that's crazy. But this produces a lot of asymmetry. So for a long time, it felt like the red team was able to kind of walk over the blue team for a number of years. There was like a golden age where we didn't have to really worry about getting caught. That's not the case anymore. Blue is absolutely caught up, and they've started to really make red's life very, very difficult. But part of that reason, I believe, my thesis, is this data asymmetry. They have huge amounts of data about what's normal, data that they can train their own internal models on, that we don't have access to if we're not a research institution or we're not an EDR vendor. It is difficult for us to even get installs for most EDRs, because if they see Harmjoy or SpectreOps and the requests coming in, they're just going to say no, And like this has happened a lot and happens to other people as well. So I'm not going to go through any hoops or something or try to bend the rules to actually get an install. I'm going to play by the rules myself, but it's asymmetric, right? Like I don't get to even see what I'm going up against unless I'm in a client environment. It turns into a black box problem. Also, as a side note though, one kind of advantage that red tends to have sometimes over blue, or at least like defensive teams, is defensive teams also often tend to work more with metadata than full raw data itself. So depending on the EDR platform you have, you might only get certain bits of information about events or what was logged and things like that. Red, if we have an agent on a box, we can pull whatever we want. We can write tooling to pull whatever we want. So we have a bit of flexibility and extensibility of building, we're basically building our own collectors, but the scale is very different. So again, these scales are orders of magnitude larger on the defensive side, right? Like, if you say a terabyte of data, like, to an EDR vendor, they're gonna laugh. As opposed to a terabyte of data on the offensive side, you're like, how am I gonna go through all these logs? Oh my God, like, I don't wanna go through like 100 gigs of email spools or something like that. Because again, previously it had been mostly manual on the offensive side. But because of this kind of scale difference in the base rate issue that I'm gonna talk about in a couple of slides, defense has to be right nearly 100% of the time. So like I always like the example of like a 99% accurate antivirus scanner is terrible. Like, and this is, I think, and I'll get into exactly why in a couple of slides, but this is one of the things that I think academia on the ML side hasn't quite grasped. They're like, oh, cool, we got 96% accuracy doing X, Y, and Z. But with the rarity of malicious events, the base rates, the difference in these, like, you have so many false positives that people just drown in alerts and they're gonna turn everything off. On the flip side, offense, we only have to be mostly right, most or some of the time. We're way more tolerant of false positives and false negatives because, yeah, cool, my thing didn't quite flag that, or like, I'll probably find something else, or if it flagged a few false positives, or even half the results are false positives, I can manually go through that as a manual filter and probably figure out what I want to get. So, I don't know, I've spent a lot of time with one of our leaders, Jared Atkinson, that I worked with a number of years, and he loves thinking about these types of like larger kind of meta problems, of the balance of false positives and false negatives, and the difference and across different security like chunks and stuff like that. But as an example, for base rate fallacy, if you're not aware, I think most people usually are, but it's a type of fallacy where people tend to ignore the base rates or kind of the general prevalence of an event in favor of information pertaining to a specific case. That's from Wikipedia. The example they give on the page is, okay, if you look at people hospitalized with COVID-19, you say, oh my God, there's more people that are hospitalized that are vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Well, the base rate of those two things and those two groups are different. So in actuality, the hospitalization rate is 5 times higher for the unvaccinated population versus the vaccinated population. Like, as humans, we're bad at estimating these types of things. But putting it in a different example that hits closer to home for us, let's say we have, 1 million events that we've collected from an organization, and 0.01% of those events are malicious. Say 100 are malicious. Seems like, kind of ballpark, not super far off. If we run a detection that's 99% accurate, we will only fail to detect one of the malicious events. Great, we miss one malicious event. We catch all 99. But we'll misclassify 9,999 events as malicious when they're actually benign. So we're going to flood people with nearly 10,000 alerts that are going to be false. So this is one of the issues I think academia people are starting to kind of realize now, that these accuracy rates they matter for like on the defensive side. Last kind of bit, like human-focused tooling for anyone that's used Cobalt Strike. Yeah, hi Dick, that had to use it last week. There's some of these toolings, when they're built for humans, you don't even have like structured input and output. You can't even list like taskings to responses right now for a lot of C2 tools. It gets frustrating because there's a lot of cooler things we could do if our tools actually allowed us to do so. So I think this will change over the next couple of years. There's a project called Mythic that a coworker works on, Cody Thomas. It's a feature that has a super amazing data model that has everything structured really, really well. So a couple more slides on, I just wanted to touch on kind of some collection challenges and modeling challenges, and then I'm going to get into a little bit more of the ML side. One of the things we ran into is batch versus incremental ingestion. So ideally, we want to take all data from all C2s, and every piped in thing, we want to take all offensive data and unify it. That's our general goal. One of the modeling challenges here is you don't always know when data collection is complete. Like, what if you have incremental ingestion coming in over low and slow C2? What if you have a file listing that comes in one file at a time? That particular state of how you say, like, this data is complete is complicating. We have a whole post and a white paper we're publishing on like some of this modeling stuff, hopefully in the next month or two, if people are interested. I know host modeling probably is the most fascinating topic for some people. But there's another thing that's kind of, I termed it information compression, not from the ML standpoint, but historically offensive tools have done a lot of processing on the host itself, and they've returned relevant information. Canonical example like PowerUp or a PrivS type tool will analyze the raw data on a host and return PrivS opportunities. Well, it does a ton of things. It's analyzing registry keys and files and all these different types of things, but it's compressing all of that information to just what the relevant results are. So if we want to do new research in the future, if we find a new way to PrivS, we don't have the opportunity to retroactively analyze that historical data because it was lost. So we want to move towards collecting the raw data and processing offline. That's kind of one of the points with Nemesis that I'll talk through. This also gives us a lot more opportunities from like an ML standpoint, is we don't have to only interact with human-based tools, we can interact with the raw data the tools process. So from a modeling standpoint, offensive focused data models do exist, but they've generally been in isolation, so like something like Bloodhound. Bringing all this together as like a unified offensive model is very, very hard, particularly due to the tool diversity and the lack of interop between data and tools. And it's like weird. It's difficult to model all data from all offensive tools in a unified way. Like, who would have thunk that? Like, sounds like an easy problem, right? But we are trying to solve this problem with Nemesis, and we're trying to move towards a unified model. It was just significantly more difficult than we thought. But we're not giving up. We've got some new releases coming out in the next month and got a bunch of new stuff. I'll talk about a little bit of it at the end of the talk. So, offensive machine learning challenges. So one of the big things is there's a lack of dual domain experts. So there's very few people that are truly versed in both information security and machine learning. Like I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, that shared vocabulary that we're all starting to establish, like it's hard. It's not knowing the math is hard. We're not going to understand a lot of these data science type things, right? It's difficult. You have to spend the time to learn it. Same on the kind of the data science side. An adversarial mindset isn't something that you usually just come up with overnight. Like learning that thought process, learning how we solve problems on the offensive side is something that's going to take some time. And also my other shout out, I know I've already said plenty of nice things about them, but these two guys from Dreadnought that are going to be talking about, they've definitely helped me over the past few years. There are a number of other people in pockets that have started to establish these types of things, but there's not that many that are really, really good at both kind of, specialties. I'm definitely not. I'm still trying to learn. So a bit on data sets. Existing public security data sets have been largely terrible. If you've read any academic historic papers of the last 10 years, they're academia, from what I can tell. Again, speaking as an outsider, it's just my opinion, not the opinion of anyone else necessarily, but a lot of the things I'd read, it seems like academia is used to using reference data sets for a number of different problems they'll try to solve. Like if you want to build a better image classifier, everyone always shows how it performs against MNIST or something like that, right? For security, there's a handful of kind of canonical reference data sets, but they were all like 7 to 10 years old, so meaning they're worthless. Often they were done from like weird national lab type stuff, and everything was anonymized to the point that you lose a huge amount of data that's useful. But there's some things that complicate this. You have like the class imbalance problem with like malicious events being rare, like the whole base rate type thing. You have the privacy problem that I'll talk to in the next slides. And I don't know how to term this, but like the defensive close hold problem. It's like defensive people a company isn't going to want to release unredacted security logs about a compromise or something, right? This just isn't going to happen. It's like, but it ends up that no one releases high quality, timely, realistic security data. And this is a big problem for us as like kind of the public industry. There are people that are private that are able to collect this at their large scale EDRs, or someone like Microsoft, or someone like CrowdStrike, or something like that. But like, why would they release all that when that's a competitive advantage? So it's just, I don't have a solution to this. It's just me, again, yelling at clouds, I guess. But you know, also kind of from a close hold, companies like to keep things close hold as do not tip off attackers. That kind of exacerbates that information asymmetry, but that's just kind of the nature of the game. The privacy problem with all the big LLM vendors. As noted above, we may use the content you provide. This is OpenAI's privacy policy. We may use it to improve our services, for example, to train the models that power ChatGPT. All these places have different privacy policies. Supposedly you can like opt out of using things for retraining, but they reserve the right to observe like inputs and outputs for troubleshooting. Unless you do certain professional services like Azure's OpenAI offering has like contractual privacy agreements. But, you know, I always, you know, asking some of the guys on my team, they're like, oh great, like we can use OpenAI for everything. It's like, would you trust OpenAI with, or another provider with the client's domain admin password? Like, even if you wanted to, based on like client contracts and compliance, are you even allowed to? So this is a question that I think we didn't all kind of anticipate as an industry, as a professional industry. Obviously the black hat guys aren't gonna care and they're just gonna shove data in. But we've been using cloud services for a while, and there's a compliance thing with that for a long period of time. But you know, putting data in S3 bucket, that data isn't being observed and extracted and reprocessed for things by Amazon, right? So like, it's a different problem that I think kind of hit us a little bit unanticipated. And there are ways kind of around this, but it's something that we struggle with to a degree. Like, because the best models, the state-of-the-art ones, we're having to work out how that meshes with like client contracts and privacy agreements and things like that. So fun, contracts. But one of the, not revelations, I should have known this sooner, but synthetic data. So like good quality labeled data has always been probably one of the single biggest factors that's held us back offensively. I've talked to several people, you know, yesterday where I always say it's like one of the most frustrating things is knowing you could solve a problem, but not having the data for it. Like, you're like, I know I could do this. I know it will work. I know I can do the sandbox detection. I know I can do this EDR evasion. I know I could do whatever, but I don't have access to the data because I don't work at a vendor that has access to, you know, exabytes of data, right? But this isn't a silver bullet, but large-scale state-of-the-art models can be used to generate high-quality synthetic data that we can use to fine-tune smaller models. There's one reason why a lot of smaller models have gotten so good, right? People pulled together all the GPT-4 responses and things like that, and new training, there's lots of different reasons the small ones got good, but this is one of them, is having better data that was synthetically generated by these larger models. And again, not a math guy. Yeah, I would love to talk to a math guy about this after, but from what I can tell, I think this is an open question, that the distribution for generated synthetic data can, at least in some cases, differ from the distribution of real-world data it's mimicking. So this isn't a silver bullet. So the data we're generating that's fake is a good approximation in a lot of cases. It's not the same as real data. But it's better not having any data at all. So I think we're gonna, like baby steps, we're gonna start going with some of this stuff and then see where it takes us over the next year or two. Also, something on, this has been on the privacy problem too, why we can't release models, why we can't fine-tune an offensive model historically and release it. So it comes down to the inversion ML attack that, you know, some people talked about yesterday. This is the recovery of training data from deployed models through a number of different methods. Kind of one of the classic examples I stole from Nick's deck is there's an inversion attack from a paper, I think 2015, showing you could, it started with images because they could do like this particular type of optimization, recover the training samples. But it's actually in like the OWASP LLM top 10 for like sensitive information disclosure, whether you get an LLM to like somehow disclose any of the sensitive data that it was trained on. Like one of them, they were talking about, you know, ways that you could optimize an LLM to output social security numbers by, you know, exploiting some of the patterns and some of these specific types of optimization attacks. But this has been around for a long time. I think this paper was from like 2017, extracting training data from large language models, having Carlini and everybody else. And it's not just LLMs, it's also even just embedding models. So like we can't even release an embedding model trained on private data. We have to assume that any model we release the data it was trained on, at least parts of it, could leak out at some point. So offensively, there's plenty of people, for example, that have said publicly, we have a model that extracts passwords from documents and files. No one has released that publicly, because if they trained it on private data, then it might leak out a bunch of private passwords that it was trained on, right? So this is another complicating factor that if you're training models on really sensitive data, it makes it very difficult to share these models with the rest of the community. But synthetic data, I think, is a kind of a compromise. It's a balance in the middle, right, to where if we can use data from OpenAI or whatever else, or Gemini or something, generate enough samples and train stuff locally, maybe we could release some of these models that could help accelerate people's operations. And kind of last little slide before I talk about Nemesis, but there's generally been a lack of security-focused models, again, because people are hesitant to share them. There was Cybert that was released in 2019. That was like a BERT tuned on like cybersecurity data. That was one of the few. There's a couple more that have started to come out with fine tunes on Hugging Face. Like Lily was one I ran across. I have not played with it yet. There's some of these smaller ones that people are starting to tune. There's a bunch of like random ones from random people on Hugging Face that I'm not going to trust. Like I want to trust something coming from a company and not from, you know, LLM Hacker 86 or something like that on Hugging Face. So, but yeah, there's as I've been starting to play in this space, not as a data scientist, there aren't as many models focused on these particular subject area that lets me solve the problems I want to do, which means we have to go build them ourselves in a way that hopefully we can share. That's the goal, promise. So I'm going to touch on Nemesis real quick and how it kind of ties into all this stuff. So our vision for Nemesis from the offensive data problem was we want a centralized processing platform that ingests, enriches, and performs analytics on offensive data. So we want to build an operator assistance platform. That's the general goal. But first, we need to get the data into it, ideally in a fairly structured way. Full disclosure, we started building this before LLMs like blew the world apart, but we still think there's value for it because the more structured the data is, there's certain things you can do with it that you can't do with just throwing a bunch of data in LLM. Our kind of elevator pitch is like, imagine virus total for offensive engagements, are gathering all this offensive data from an op and having it ingested into a structured form that you can actually interact with. There's my big scary architecture diagram that I made in PowerPoint because I don't know how to use Visio. But we have, I won't go through every single little bit and whatever of this, and we have blog posts, and we have a ton of documentation on this stuff. And again, we have a white paper coming out in about a month. But we have, on the left, we have ingesters for common command and control frameworks, Stage 1, Cobalt Strike, Mythic, Interpreter, things like that. These just take data, put it in a semi-structured form. We have a well-defined like data structured interface. We call them operational data references. So like if you want to submit data about a service, it needs to be formatted in a particular way. Those get posted to an API that's part of a Kubernetes cluster. We use MinIO or S3 as the data lake, your choice. Keep everything in-house or scale it indefinitely. We use RabbitMQ for queuing, but we have lots of enrichments. So this is like an enrichment flow pipeline. There's nothing super special from an architectural standpoint. It's all just microservices, everything's Kubernetes. We extract passwords if we can. We try to crack things. We do natural language processing and text extraction. We'll talk about .NET stuff, and some of these things I'll show in the demo. And then in the end, all the data is put into a highly structured form, if appropriate, into Postgres, and in a semi-structured form in Elastic. Then we have a nice little dashboard. We got logging, all that fun Kubernetes stuff. But when I mean enrichments, this is the type of thing that tends to happen. We'll have like a .NET, a program that gets downloaded through a command and control agent. The workflow or the flow system will determine this is .NET. It'll pass it through the .NET enrichment process to pull .NET appropriate metadata, like type refs, signatures, imports, things like that. It'll check for like deserialization vulnerabilities and command execution vulnerabilities automatically using an IL level scanner that we have. It'll decompile the C# source and grant it to you so you can just download it. This is nothing that people can't do on their own. It just does all those little minor steps in a couple of seconds instead of having you do it manually. Then all that data is put into Postgres and Elastic and surfaced through the Nemesis dashboard and Kibana. And I know it's super small text. I'll put this slide deck up on Slide share, I have my slide share link at the end of this. I'll also put it in the Discord and I'll tweet it out. So I'll make sure all the slides are up. But TLDR, we have nice little structured data for everything. Deserialized gadgets and all that fun stuff. So the general goal is we want to automate away that level 1 analysis, those boring tasks, and perform a much offline analysis in the raw data as possible. This approach permits analyzing relationships between kind of previously disparate data sources to accomplish things that used to require manual analysis. So we want to join all these data sources together. For example, one other big thing that Nemesis will do is it exploits their relationships with DP API data, the data protection API, like domain backup keys, system master keys, DP API blobs. These are all linked together, and Nemesis keeps track of all of that and can do forward and backwards decryption once keys come in. But our goal is to provide that operator feedback on suggestions based on the collected data. This is the goal we're working towards. And this is obviously where LLM integration is going to come in. Just over the last week or two, talking with the Dreadnought guys, I had a million different ideas on augments that we can put into this. The general approach we're probably going to try to do is have the ability to put inference endpoints and keys into a Nemesis config and have services that do particular enrichments like summarization or password extraction and things like that. Any enrichment we can come up with LLMs, we'll have it from an inference standpoint where it reaches out to another service, because while this can scale infinitely, or it can scale very high with Kubernetes, we always want to be able to support you running it on a local instance, which is right now a Minikube with like 10 gigs of RAM for the Minikube instance. We're going to move to K3s soon, but we don't want to require you to have an extra 10, 12 gigs of RAM to run a local LLM or something. So we're going to go, but there's going to be some hopefully cool future stuff coming in the future. So I've got my one little quick demo, and then it's only 1 minute, and then I'll try to show our little LLM thing. I know this text is small, I'm sorry I can't quite zoom in, but we're downloading our assembly, everything I talked about, through our C2 interface, and ingest everything into Nemesis, gives us information back saying, oh, there's deserialization. We see, my super fancy Streamlit interface because I'm not a UI guy. Well, we see it can like pull apart all these things, detect deserialization. You can pull the file, you can check additional raw information, pull down the extracted source code, and we'll show that. I really wish I would have zoomed in the demo, I apologize. But just showing, yep, it had like a super basic binary formatter deserialization type thing. So again, nothing super, super crazy, but it just makes your life hopefully a little bit easier. All right. The one other thing I wanted to show was we have a lot of natural language processing in the background of Nemesis, and one of the things that we released last week that I did a whole blog post on Medium was we actually built a local LLM-powered chatbot that functions on all the retrieved extracted data. So when a file goes into Nemesis, if it can have text extracted, it's extracted through Apache Tika. The text is then chunked and indexed with a small embedding model, put into a vector database in Elastic. Then we actually do the classic kind of BM25 fuzzy search and vector search, fuse them together using a technique called reciprocal rank fusion. TLDR, we do a bunch of fancy search stuff. You get hopefully good snippets of text, like 500 tokens or something like that. Then if you take this Ragnarok tool that hosts the local LLM on your laptop, and then you point it to a Nemesis instance, and I've got everything all nice and tail scaled up, but you point it to a Nemesis instance, it'll call that search API in the backend that we expose. Let's see. And then you can ask questions for documents that you downloaded. So we have a customized re-ranker that's running locally. I'm running just like a quantized version of one of the Intel models, neural something. But you can say, what is a Windows token? And it gets it pretty right, based purely on some white papers that I ingested into it for the demo. But also, we will link people to the file itself in Nemesis, as well as the exact snippet that was extracted in Elastic. So you can track your references back, and you can adjust the initial K, the temperature, and also total number of results fed to the prompts. This is retrieval augmented generation, which I can't explain in 30 seconds, but if you're interested and not familiar, grab me in the back and I'm more than happy to talk through all this. But chatbots, yay. And this is for any data scientists or ML people, that's the easiest thing. It's really cool to InfoSec people, it's cool to me, but data science people are like, this is the most boring problem. This problem has already been solved for like years now for this architecture. But hopefully, I don't know, I think it's neat. You get to like chat over stolen client documents in like a secure way. Seems pretty cool. So last few slides, I'm almost done. Kind of circling everything back, saying like seeing the forest for the trees, like why does this matter? Why spend all this time trying to engineer this type of data platform? And our goal and what we think is it's not just what Nemesis does, it's what it will allow us to do. So we're trying to be the choke point for almost all C2s, where data will flow into this particular platform. So if you want to do enrichments, or if you want to use this as a data store, like pull data down to do your own research or ML training or anything, where you want to be a centralized point for that. And we're hoping that potentially, for us, it's starting to be a shift from running like tools on host to trying to pull having dumb tools that pull raw data down in a simplified manner and do the processing off host. So minimize the offensive footprint, do all the processing off host. Like we want to be able to do PrivS analysis with raw data we pull down from the registry instead of having to run a C# tool on host. And then also we think it'll provide a lot of avenues for research, for large language model augmentation, tons of like all the super cool fancy new stuff. The last slide, kind of some of the general advantages that we view for this, like we can centrally update workflow analysis or we can centrally update operator analysis workflows. We have all of our operators using this. If we want to add a new enrichment, if someone figures out how to exploit a new file or something, we can add that into the platform and everybody gets it forever. Also in the past, because we can do retroactive data analysis. Again, exactly what I just said. These enrichments exist in perpetuity for all operators and all operations. We can do offline processing. This allows for that retroactive analysis of data. So if I find a new .NET gadget, that deserialization gadget or something, and I augment my check, I push that in and update the Kubernetes cloud that I'm running this all on, I can reprocess all of my data and then find stuff in the past, as well as continuing in the future. Again, minimizing footprint of offensive tooling, and that collected structured and unstructured data, we're hoping can guide future research and automation, in particular around the large language kind of space. So that was me talking for 45 minutes to everybody. Hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully there's a couple of things you hadn't thought about in a particular way. I'm going to post the slides on my slide share here in a second. I will put it in Discord, but it'll come up on my site as well. I'll also tweet it out from Harmjoy. Our SpectraOps site, we do a lot of cool work. If you want to check it out, please come talk to me. And we also have Nemesis on GitHub. So yeah, unless I think I'm right about at time, so yes, Will.
On scaling tradecraft, do you see that as a tool or a training problem primarily, or do you think it's a problem?
So the question was, on scaling tradecraft, do I think it's a tool or a training problem? I honestly think it's both. Like training for sure is, we don't want to just put an automagic tool in front of an operator and say, push this button and it does everything. I think it more is of a fusion problem for like operator like augmentation, because you do need to train people, and that's its own separate problem that I don't have to deal with anymore because I don't run our red team. We have other people that have been working on that problem. I think tooling has its place, but it's not the 100% solution for sure. So it's a perfect non-answer, I guess, of like, yes, both.
Curious in your opinion.
Yeah.
I'll keep that. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So when you're talking about like people not releasing like high quality timely data,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can tell from like our personal experience, like actually getting data analyzed in a timely manner for clients is challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Getting it productized to share with anyone else is, I hate to say
Yeah.
it, but like near insurmountable. And like even with our commercial clients, we're working with them on like, let's build a thread intel program. The sharing piece, like, because inevitably like separating, you need somebody like understands like how do I remove tokens that are
Yeah.
like password hashes.
Yeah, so like anonymization, scrubbing, like getting it to the point where you can even share with like trusted people is definitely a huge problem. I was meaning kind of where I was coming with that angle for, the sharing data problem was almost kind of from the academic side, or these public reference data sets by timely, I don't mean in a week or two, I mean like within the last 1 or 2 years, which most of the reference sets are like, if you're doing a network attack reference set that's 8 years old and has telnet in it, like that's worthless. That's worse than worthless. It's going to give you a solution that like is very not applicable. So it's, like, I recognize it's a huge problem. I literally have no idea how to solve it. It's just something that's complicated it for us. Because even if people want to like play around with these things and start to learn this, like those smaller reference data sets outside of the super small toy ones that are super old just don't really exist.
And I guess like one of the questions on synthetic data, like we've tried to work with synthetic data in the threat intel space and run into like just massive problems with like the quality of data there. So for example, like threat data, like one of the most prolific feeds is like largely like just like pure number of data points is driven by basically scanning data that
Yep.
people are like, oh, these are attacks, and you're like, okay,
Yep.
like so even like establishing a common vernacular, like how do you look at what's going to be good enough to generate solid synthetic data from? And like, is that a, like somebody has to like build that initial kernel of knowledge, or do we trust academics? What's your thought?
Yeah, so the question kind of being around like the generation and quality of synthetic data, particularly at scale, like honestly, I don't know. Like this isn't something that I really even started playing with on the synthetic side until like a couple months ago. So like I'm still forming my opinion, completely honestly. It's I think it'll be an interesting problem space that we're all going to explore over the next year or so, like publicly, especially because to me the big thing with the synthetic data stuff is it potentially democratizes the generation of some of these data sets that people that don't have access to private data can start to play with things like a little bit more. But there's obviously problems with it, and the distribution shift and all that. I would love to talk to some academics about it because I'm sure there's been studies that show like, look, this isn't representative. But then there's that like, I don't know, like I haven't been on the other side where I get to like deal with like real data at scale for like an EDR, a defensive standpoint. So would love to like chat with you later about some stuff. And like there's definitely, it's an interesting problem space that I think we're all going to be tackling over the next year or two.
Last
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Less serious. Do you think that Lubix's comment has to do with like that he hasn't been on like a large food red team, like related to like his not having seen good documentation?
Oh. Honestly, I don't know. Question being for the tweet about I've talked to a lot of people in the industry, and I think some places do very good documentation, and some places don't. Like it's definitely not a 90% of the people have it solved. I think the really mature teams that have been going for a while and scale beyond 5 operators have had to work out processes for this, otherwise they would just implode. That said, a lot of people I've talked with, over 10 years definitely have terrible documentation, or they haven't had to deal with that because it's like 3 or 4 guys, dealing with stuff, and you don't have to have that same level of documentation and training scaling and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's the size of that. I mean, the thing that we see on the offensive side is just like the number of offensive tools and frameworks and like that proliferation. Like, there's so many different ways to like skin a cat.
Yeah.
Like, maintaining up-to-date documents for an
Yeah.
internal team on top of like keeping on top of change logs for all the
Yeah, and you're talking about and vetting all the new public tools, and then saying, okay, we don't want to use this one anymore, but we have 3 different C2s or 4 different C2s, and how do we do everything? It's definitely challenging. So I think I'm not like we're hoping Nemesis can play its part, but even if it doesn't, working towards workflow automation and augmentation, I think is going to be important. All right, I think he's calling time now. So, all right, thank you guys.